I moved into an old city apartment. Every night, I heard footsteps in an empty room, and then found a photograph that changed everything I believed. I knew from the first night something about that apartment did not add up. Not because the walls whispered to me, but because a slow, precise rhythm kept coming from a room that, according to everything logical, was empty. It sounded like someone tapping heel the floor in a tempo that matched my pulse, and every time I tried to convince myself it was a building settling or a rat in the walls, the rhythm would shift deliberate, as if it had noticed me listening and decided to keep time anyway. When I first moved to Mexico City for one of my early jobs, I picked a cheap 3-bedroom unit on the 4th floor of a weathered building in a historic center. The facade was old stone and mosaic tile, the kind of architecture that promised charm and then reminded you of the city's grime. Rain left a thin smog on the windows, and maintenance felt like a suggestion rather than a plan. The stairwell was a hulking vertical hall of the building's original material, polished, cracked, marbled in places, and in one corner you could still see blackened patches from a fire that, a neighbor told me, had happened decades earlier. It was a 3-bedroom with combined living, kitchen, dining area and the smallest balcony I'd ever seen. Barely room to stand with a cigarette or whatever else someone might stand on a balcony to enjoy. One bedroom faced the street, the other two faced the interior courtyard, where neighbors hung clothes on lines like a shared, outdoor laundry room. The floors were wood, aged and uneven in spots, little ridges where moisture had puffed the boards up and changes in temperature had made thin waves that caught the light at odd angles. The youngest of the three of us packed up and left after a few months. He was gone so quickly it felt like he had only been a convenience of the year. The other roommate, Carlos, had moved in just weeks before I did. He was from the coast, a photographer who worked on small projects downtown. Easy to laugh and quick to light up a cigarette. He didn't like his room, the one that faced the street, and complained about drafts and nights of poor sleep. He'd come home, rub his hands on his knees like he was checking if the world still existed, and say things about the cold getting under his bones. Carlos often asked if we'd been in his room when he came back from work, because sometimes the window would be open. We'd tease him about being paranoid, about smoking too much and inventing conspiracies to spice his routine. Eventually he switched rooms with the youngest, and the room he left became a kind of emptiness. A single plastic chair, the sort you see in convenience stores and cheap bars, hollow and lightweight, left against the wall like an accusation. For the holidays that year, Carlos traveled to be with his family, and I decided to stay in the city. The other bedroom that faced the street remained unrented. That was when the tapping began to seem less like an oddity and more like a personality. The first night I noticed it properly, I was on the couch, the television on low, trying to make the apartment feel inhabited. The sound cut through the canned laugh track and hum of fluorescent lights, a neat, repeated tick-tick-tick that came from the clothes room. I turned the television down and listened. The sound wasn't outside or above. It was inside that room. I told myself it was nothing. Pipes settling, an animal in the beams. I walked over, opened the door, and the light hit a bare room with a plastic chair and an open window that let in a winter draft. I closed the window, felt foolish, and went back to the couch with a beer in my hand. The next night, while I was making a sandwich, meat, cheese, condiments, tomato like it was a luxury, the tapping began again, closer this time, as if whatever made had learned my schedule and chosen to perform. I froze with a knife in my hand, like an actor in a cheap thriller. The noise came in steady waves. I stood near the door and waited, stupidly hoping the sound would stop if I didn't give it attention. When it didn't, I flung the door open and switched the light on. Empty, the window open. I slammed it shut and sat down in the plastic chair because I was suddenly invested in catching a prankster. The chair creaked under me and the taps continued, a metronome for the absurd. That chair became a character in my nights. Sometimes the tapping sounded like a small set of heels, neat and insistent. Other times it was a softer, more sporadic staccato that suggested boards shifting against one another. I started keeping a notebook to track when it happened, trying to impose logic on something that felt so stubbornly unreasonable. I recorded audio, set a phone on the windowsill, then a camera on the ledge, hoping to catch a mischievous neighbor, an animal, anything. The recording showed faint sounds, the usual life of an old building, creaks, settling, wind through a crack, but never the clean cadence I remembered. Once the window opened on its own while I was sitting in a chair in the room. It snapped with a springy sound, and a draft washed my face. I spun around, and the tapping was behind me, louder, as if following the movement of my breath. My heart leaned into the panic, and my legs felt like someone had poured gelatin into them. I turned and faced the room, expecting an intruder, a prankster, or perhaps the real-life equivalent of a jump scare. There was only the chair, its hollow legs making tiny soft taps against the uneven floor in the draft. The window's latch, old and tired, would sometimes slip if the metal relaxed just right. The chair was an instrument that translated the building's small injustices into a rhythm. Even once I had a reasonable explanation. The latch, a favorite floorboard, the sensation of being watched persisted. I began to notice details I had not before. A mug in the sink that smelled faintly of tobacco, though no one had been smoking there. A photograph half hidden beneath a stack of mail showing 3 people on the stoop, with one face blurred by shadow. Little things accumulated like coins in a drawer until they made a weight I couldn't ignore. When I brought up Carlos to the landlord, the man looked at me as if I had asked about a ghost. He frowned, rubbed his chin, and said, "Carlos? I don't know any Carlos." He repeated it like a simple fact. I told him about the room swap, about the guy who had left for the holidays, expecting at least a shrug of memory. He insisted he had never rented to anyone by that name. That denial lodged under my tongue like a pebble. How could someone who had lived in the place share a name that did not belong in a ledger? I started digging. I checked the lease, the old messages, receipts from the convenience store across the street. I scoured the photos on my phone. I found a picture of the 3 of us outside the building, shoulders leaning into each other in the kind of casual closeness you have after sharing bills and late-night chores. One face in that photo was half dark. The notes in my phone contained grocery lists and an odd scribbled number in someone else's handwriting. A woman I called who had once known a Carlos said she remembered him but dated the memory years before. Nothing fit. The building had folded ordinary life into its walls in such a way that memory felt porous. Neighbors told stories in fragments. The old woman on the 2nd floor spoke of tenants who never returned, of people who moved out and left rooms smelling like cigarettes and histories that clung to plaster. A stoic man who fixed vending machines pointed me to an old notice posted near the stairwell, a faded paper about a fire, and a list of displaced tenants. Names scattered like autumn leaves. My landlord shuffled through a creased ledger and still found no Carlos. The disbelief in his voice was not entirely convincing. I found myself altering my behavior. I left lights on at night. I checked the locks twice, sometimes 3 times. I began to talk to neighbors more, not really to gather answers, but because human voices feel like a buoy in a tugging sea. A neighbor would joke about the building being alive in its own way. Another would say places keep the shape of those who live there. I started to see the chair less as evidence of a haunting and more as a translator, a small, hollow thing that turned structural oddities into a pattern my ears could interpret. In the weeks that followed, the tapping developed seasonal nuance. Rain made it slower. Dry heat sharpened it. I charted the tempo and found variations, micro phrases in the sound, as if it were a language with dialects. It stopped altogether sometimes for whole weeks, and then returned with a new signature. Once in a while it would pause in the middle, as if listening. I set up a proper camera that streamed to my phone and watched the feed from work. For nights it was blank, a still room with a chair and a cast of light across the floor. Then, at 2 a.m. on a cold Tuesday, the camera caught a subtle event. The chair rocked, the window sighed, and in the reflection of the glass there was a small movement like a shadow shifting a fraction of an inch. I rewound the footage and watched the corner of the room where the light caught dust in a certain way. The motion was so slight it might have been a trick of pixels, but it made me hold my breath for a long time. When I pressed the landlord again about who had lived in the room before me, his irritation frayed into something else. He turned a photograph over on his desk, paused, and handed it to me. It was a group photo from years ago, 3 shapes at a community event, something like a building procession, and there on the 4th floor window, when you squinted, there was a faint outline of a person framed by glass. He shrugged. "Buildings keep things," he said. "Sometimes names slip." The shrug felt like a small concession to mystery, not an answer. I became practiced at telling myself stories to manage the interior weather. Maybe Carlos had been a tenant 10 years ago. Maybe he'd been a friend of someone else. Maybe I had folded two different people into one memory, because loneliness makes your brain a sloppy archivist. I told the story aloud in the mirror, trying to snap the logic back together by speaking it. Memory is guilty of improvisation. It will invent details to make a narrative satisfying. Neighbors offered quieter versions of that explanation. The man who fixed vending machines talked about the building capacity to collect people like shells, stores of habit and sound. Don't let your story get lonely, he told me once, as if the thing to fear was not ghosts, but the human inclination to let a lack of answer become a demand. The apartment had been home to so many brief lives that it made sense some of them would remix themselves into something that sounded like a tapping at night. I started writing letters to whoever might have lived in that room, folding plain paper into envelopes and sliding them into a crack by the stair or tucking them under a tile. The letters were silly and practical at once. Small reports on my life, trivial confessions, an inventory of the tapping's moods. I posted them like offerings, more to prove to myself I was keeping track than because I believed they would be read. A photograph slid under my door one morning without fanfare. It was grainy, dusk over the courtyard, and in the fourth-floor window there was a pale shape. On the back someone had written, in a looping hand, "Keep your ears open." No signature. The handwriting felt familiar, in a way that hurt, like the memory of a laugh you can't quite place. It suggested both a prank and a tender warning. I clutched the photo and felt a strange gratitude toward the anonymous messenger. The gesture narrowed the cold part of fear into something more like attention. As months passed, the tapping became a background instrument to my small routines. I learned to live around it, to let it suggest rather than command. I had nights of ordinary loneliness and nights when the tapping felt like company, a banal metronome that punctuated my apartment into manageable segments. I left my lease in place when the time came to decide whether to move, partly out of stubbornness, partly because leaving it would mean admitting defeat to an unexplained noise that had become, in its odd way, familiar. A new tenant eventually moved into the building, a woman with a small boy who raced toy cars down the hall. Their life made the courtyard noisier, and children have a way of neutralizing old mysteries with their blunt curiosity. The tapping persisted but seemed less imposing when it had to make room for laughter and the clack of plastic cars. The boy would sometimes press his ear to the door and announce solemnly that someone was playing in there. His mother would hum, ruffle his hair, and say, "Old buildings hold on to their own music." I never discovered a formal record of a Carlos who had lived in the room right before me. The landlord never showed a signed agreement in that name. Neighbors' recollections wavered. The photograph that appeared without explanation remained both a clue and a tease. The building kept its habits, and I kept mine. The sound, once a threat, grew into a private geography I could map with a few scribbled notes. Times, weather, the way it changed when a delivery truck idled out on the street. In the end, the whole thing taught me how to live with ambiguity. I could not prove whether the tapping was the result of an old latch, a shifted floorboard, a prank, a long-ago occupant's habit translated into structure, or the imagination of someone who slept alone in a fourth-floor apartment. I kept the small rituals that made living there possible. I checked the locks before bed. I left the light on in the living room. I kept a spare sandwich in the fridge. On the morning, I handed the keys to the new tenant, the older man from the stairwell who had kept a small inventory of neighbors for as long as anyone could remember. He pressed an envelope into my hand and said nothing. Inside was the same courtyard photograph I'd found months earlier in a note. Some stories are best left as rhythms. He winked like a man sharing a private joke with someone who finally knew how to listen. I left with a suitcase, notebooks filled with observations, and a small gratitude for the place that held my unease. The tapping had never been something grand, no dramatic apparition, no table-flipping poltergeist, just a persistent ordinary noise that pushed me to pay attention, to ask questions, and to accept that not every mystery required a solution. Some demanded only an audience. As the bus pulled away and the building shrank in the rear view, I thought about the younger version of myself who had believed in names as anchors, receipts, signatures, clear facts that could be filed. The city taught me otherwise. It taught me to live with partial evidence and to carry narratives lightly. Maybe Carlos was a tenant who fell through an administrative crack. Maybe he was a memory stitched into a photograph and a swinging chair. Maybe, most likely, I'd been given a story by a place that wanted to be noticed. Either way, it left me listening when perhaps I had been the one most in need of being heard. Either way, it left me listening when perhaps I had been the one most in need of being heard. I say that like I had a choice, like I could walk away from a tension that had already wrapped itself around me. But the truth was Messier. The sound had become a discomfort I carried like a pebble in my shoe. I noticed at odd times now, in the middle of conversations, under the whir of a fan, inside the steady throttle of city noise. It was there when I tried to sleep and there when I woke, sometimes patient, sometimes urgent, like a neighbor knocking to remind you bills exist. I started to understand that my life inside that apartment had been refashioned by small attentions. When you live long enough in a place with particular quirk, your routines adapt. You leave a light for the chair. You avoid stepping on certain boards. You check the window a second time because the latch is a habit. Little rituals become the scaffolding that keeps the rest of your days from tilting into the uncanny. I told myself that was how adults survived oddities, by building practical rituals around them. But there was another part that felt childish. I liked being the person who knew the building's private music. It was something to own, an odd expertise that made me feel less like a transient. The photograph that had slipped under my door remained pinned to the refrigerator. The pale figure in the window looked less ghost and more habit the more I stared. A posture, a silhouette repeated enough that you could almost predict how the light would fall over it. I began to imagine previous lives in the apartment the way we imagine maps of foreign countries we never visited. Accurate in major features, inventively wrong in detail. I invented a backstory for Carlos out of small, human things. A guy who loved the sea despite living far from it, who left postcards in the drawer, who laughed at his own jokes. It soothed me to humanize whatever was half-remembered. Fear softens when you can name its edges. But neutralizing the fear didn't make the tapping stop. On nights when I was deeply tired, it would come slow and careful, as if embarrassed by my exhaustion. Once, while I was packing a small box of things to send home, the rhythm caught me in an odd place. It matched the beat of my pulse, so precisely the two layered, and made a third sound, a kind of sympathetic hum. I realized then that my body had learned its cadence. The tapping had become a metronome for my nights. When it fell out of sync, I felt chewed at the edges. On a humid evening that smelled of street food and petrol, I found a scrap of paper tucked behind the photo on my fridge. Nothing more than a sliver, the torn edge of a larger sheet, but on it someone had written a single line in hurried, shallow strokes. Listen to what the building forgets. No signature. The handwriting had urgency, a tilt of someone who used a pen to steady their own mind. I held that scrap like a talisman. Whether it was given as a kindness or a dare I could not say, but it made me feel less isolated. Someone else had noticed the room's peculiarities and had left a breadcrumb. The idea of what the building forgets lodged in me. Buildings are repositories. They hold water, gloom, the smell of frying oil, the soft residue of laughter. They forget people the way tides forget the small trails they leave on sand. I began to imagine the apartment as a place where memory pooled like rainwater in a gutter. Maybe the tapping was a leftover rhythm, the residual motion of lives that had once occupied the space, replaying in the boards and bolts. That thought made the tapping almost tender. Yet tenderness did not make me immune to dread. One night, motivated by a mix of stubbornness and something close to curiosity, I decided to sit with the door open and record everything for as long as I could. I set my phone on the table, turned its mic to on, and resolved to be brave in the measured way of someone 30-something who believes bravery involves documentation. I drank nothing that night save for black coffee. The acid seemed like a fine talisman against sleep and inattention. I sat in the plastic chair and watched the room the same way a person at a train station watches the tracks. The tapping began late and deliberate, patient as a thing that had rehearsed its performance for an audience that kept changing. I watched the chair's shadow slide across the floorboard, and the way the light caught a raised knot in the wood. The rhythm was not just sound. It was motion, a micro-oscillation that made the chair legs lean and steady. I thought of wind finding a seam and exploiting it, of metal relaxing, of physics doing what physics does, make an argument out of materials. Then, very quietly, something else happened. The pattern changed in a way that felt personal. The taps lengthened and then resolved into a cadence that sounded suspiciously like a name. Not a spoken name. I didn't hear syllables. But the sequence had an emphasis, a pulse that rose and fell like speech. The rational part of my mind insisted on explanations. Echo, coincidence, pattern-seeking. The irrational part, the one that had been absorbing late-night questions like rain, leaned forward. In that moment, I felt less like someone watching and more like someone being approached. The room's small percussive language had lured me. It was offering me something that might be a sentence if I had the ears to turn the rhythm into meaning. I slept badly for nights after that recording. When I finally forced myself to listen back during the day, the file was stubbornly ordinary. The taps were clear, but the alleged cadence felt like my imagination on the replay. Yet the impression remained lodged in me. It had been a voice without words that sounded like someone calling me to remember something I couldn't yet name. I told myself I was primed for pattern, that humans are greedy for narratives. Still, the unease persisted like a bruise. The landlord had become a fixture of my story, part skeptical man, part archivist of small building histories. I would catch him in a hallway running his hands over the spines of old ledgers, the kind of person who keeps records even when records make scarcely any sense. One afternoon, I cornered him with more confidence than I felt. I asked him again about tenants, the people who lived in that fourth-floor room before me. He grimaced, the way someone grimaces when they're deciding how much to reveal. He told me a story this time, a different shape. There had been a tenant 10 years earlier, who moved out abruptly after a small but stubborn chapter of complaints about cold drafts and sleep problems. The name on the record was different, not Carlos, but the entry was smudged and marginal notes were layered atop the ink. The line moved due to ended there in a blot. No one had followed up for a long time. Old practices were full of loose ends. Buildings keep their loose ends, he said, and in the way he said it, I could hear the ledger's thin paper sigh. He handed me a small bundle of papers, an eviction notice, a utility bill with the same apartment number, a printed photograph that was almost identical to one that had appeared on my fridge. The image was aged, the colors flat, but if you squinted, the outline in the window suggested a person who had once been considered ordinary enough to photograph. The papers did not solve anything. Sometimes documents are only a way to give shape to the intangible, but they changed the tenor of my fear. Before, the apartment had been a stage for a small, persistent oddity. Now it bore the weight of time. Someone had preceded me, someone who'd left without fanfare. Memory had feathers. It left small downy pieces in corners. The building had perhaps kept one. I started to dream differently. In the dreams, the chair was sometimes occupied and sometimes not. When it was occupied, the figure sat very still, its hands quiet as if listening. When I woke, there was a feeling like someone had been in the room with me while I slept. The bed tucked into an indentation. The light had shifted, the faint smell of tobacco, though no one smoked in my apartment. Dreams and waking keep strange company in the city. You think you are awake, and the city is the dreamer. I found myself yielding to the house's small insistences, as if it were coaxing me into citizenship of its memory. Inevitably, the matter of the man who called himself Carlos, the name that wasn't on the record, came back to me. I began to look for his traces in small, mundane places where human lives leak. Scratched initials on a bar stool, tire marks on a laundry token, a matchbook with a hotel name. People leave little tail ends of themselves all over the world. I found a receipt in the couch for a cheap pair of headphones, a note with a phone number that had been scribbled and then crossed out, and a stub of a bus ticket that had been folded and refolded until the paper was tender. None of them made a robust person. Instead, they were suggestions, the way a few brushstrokes can imply a whole face. One afternoon, on a whim, I went to the municipal records office. Filing cabinets and fluorescent light, a kind of institutional patience that has survived all kinds of human eagerness. I asked about occupants of the building at the time of the fire the neighbor had mentioned years ago. A clerk, bored and efficient, found a stack of documents. They were paperwork, brittle and stapled. Names listed as tenant unknown in certain years, vacant in others. The fire had an errant note that suggested someone might have died in the general episode, but the records were messy, official forms that tried to fit chaos into columns. The clerk shrugged apologetically. Records are a living thing, he said. They'll tell you what they know. Armed with the slimmest permission, I went back to the apartment and sat under the window until the light thinned. The city hummed with its usual indifference. Vendors calling, engines, the distant clang of something being repaired. The tapping was irregular that evening, an undecided tempo. I felt foolish and awed in equal measure. If the building had indeed kept someone, what sort of person could that be? A resident? A visitor? A series of small decisions that had accreted into the slow insistence now occupying my nights? The unknown pressed against me and made me oddly protective of the vacancy. It seemed less monstrous when thought of as a human shape. A month later, on a rain-lashed morning when the city smelled wet and transistor-like, a package arrived at my door. No sender. Inside, an old key and a note that read, "For when the chairs remember." The key was small and cold, the metal worn the way a key that has been turned many times is worn. The presence of the key unsettled me in a different way than the tapping had. Keys suggest portals, access, and someone else's authority. Who had left it? A neighbor with a sentimental bent? The landlord? Someone who wanted me to look for a thing I could not yet name? I took the key to the landlord and asked about locks it might fit. He smiled a slow, private smile and told me there had been a chest left in the basement area years ago, one that had been sealed and then forgotten. Probably mice now, he said. But when he showed me the basement door, the lock there was indeed small and dusty, and when he fitted the key into the slot it turned with a reluctant completeness. The chest opened with a thin sigh of old hinges. Inside were two things, a bundle of letters and a small ceramic figurine. A tiny woman carved with surprising tenderness, her hands cupped as if holding something invisible. The letters were dated over a period that overlapped my building's various records. Quick notes of weather and fasting, mentions of a Carlos, among other names. The handwriting varied, some neat, some rushed, but the threads connected. People who had lived and left, notes offering comfort, complaints, grocery lists. One of the letters was addressed to whomever listens next, written in a hand I didn't recognize, but that made me ache when I read it. The writer apologized for being selfish and asked only that someone keep an ear out for the tapping. That chest felt like an archive of tenderness and small grief. The figurine had a crack down one side that had been filled with something like gold, a mending that made the break part of the object's beauty. I placed it on my shelf and, absurdly, felt as if I had been entrusted with a small, heavy kindness. The building, it seemed, had been used as a repository of apology and memory. Someone had deliberately left things to be found by people who might come later and listen. I read the letters until my eyes grew tired. One paragraph, in particular, caught me. It spoke of a man named Carlos who liked the way the city smelled after rain, and who would sometimes speak to strangers on the bus about photography. The writer described a kindness he'd shown to a neighbor, moving a heavy table, finding a lost cat, calling in a repair. The letter ended with a line that sounded like an ache. If you hear the tapping, know it's not a call to fear, but a call to remember. The implication was not that there was a ghost who wanted vengeance or a presence bent on cruelty, but rather an accumulation of small lives asking to be acknowledged. The tapping had the rhythm of habit and the insistence of memory. If the tapping was, in some way, an insistence to remember, I had been failing at the remembering part. I had carried my own loneliness into the space and called it occupancy. The letters forced me to reframe. No longer was I the person whose nights were being invaded. Now I was a steward of small communal history. It didn't make the tapping less unsettling, but it gave my anxiety a purpose. I decided to make a small project, a book of names and modest recollections. I would start with what I had, a photo, a handful of letters, a key, and collect other small accounts. If nothing else, it would be a way to listen properly. Collecting those stories became a patchwork undertaking. I spoke with neighbors who offered fragments, a woman who remembered a friendly man with a camera, a maintenance worker who recalled someone who always left the light on for a time when it wasn't his turn, a vendor who remembered someone buying oranges and then disappearing. Each fragment was small and differently colored, but together they made an impression of a person who had lived inside the apartment's rhythms with quiet generosity. The more I listened, the more the tapping began to feel like a leftover habit of someone who had once walked where I walked. Habit as persistence, I realized. It is a kind of stubbornness. Months passed. The city moved with its usual complicity. People left and arrived. Birthdays were celebrated on stairs. A cat that the building fed with more seriousness than it fed itself disappeared and reappeared weeks later with new limp. The tapping, once the loudest single evidence of the apartment's strangeness, softened into the background of a now busier life. I continued to write down names, dates, little events. I taped photographs into a small notebook and wrote marginal notes, like a person trying to stabilize an archive. The act of gathering became a way of giving the building back its sounds and words. The end, if there is such a thing, is a slippery thing in a city. In real life, endings are often administratively defined. A contract ends, a lease expires, a key changes hands. I handed the keys to the man who would live there next a quiet afternoon. He took them with an air of someone who had been given responsibility rather than possession. I pressed a small ceramic figurine into his hand, as if passing on a ritual, and told him, candidly, about the tapping and the letters and the chest. He listened with the patient interest of someone who had seen enough to know one must be careful with the edges of other people's stories. When I left the building that last time, the city seemed larger in the pockets of its streets. I carried a small stack of photocopies from the letters and a memory of the tapping that had taught me what it meant to pay attention. I thought I had left the last of my unease at the threshold, a neatly wrapped parcel ready for deposit in the city's indifferent mailbag. I took the bus out of the center and watched the facade of the building shrink, a mosaic of stone and grime and stories. I told myself I had created a book of names in my head, and that was enough. But endings in places like that are rarely tidy. A week after I moved out, the phone rang. My new apartment was quieter, its walls less storied, less likely to hold a chorus of small histories. I answered, and a voice I didn't immediately recognize said, "You left the lights on." It was a new tenant from the old apartment. He laughed, and in that laugh there was a relief I recognized, the relief of someone who had been given a secret to carry. He told me the tapping still came sometimes, but had softened unhurried now, as if the room had accepted a new listener. Then, without a pause, he added, "There's one thing you should know. Last night the chair moved toward the window by itself, and when I turned on the light, something was on the sill. It looked like a small, folded photograph, the one with the figure in the window. I can't explain it. Maybe it's the building's way of saying thanks." He chuckled faintly. I felt my scalp rise with a tender kind of vertigo. "Keep listening," he said, and then he hung up. The telephone line clicked with a domestic finality. I sat down on my new couch and held my breath as if catching a mosquito. The notion that the building might be capable of small, deliberate acts, placing a photograph on a sill as of an exchange, was oddly comforting. It suggested an intelligence that wasn't malicious but procedural, a system responding to stewardship. Maybe the building kept its own currency, trading memories for care. That image of photograph, placed on a window sill, felt like a benediction. Then, some nights later, I dreamed I was back in the apartment. The chair was there, the photograph, the code of the latch. The tapping began slowly, a patient code. The rhythm changed, and I felt, with a curious clarity, the impression that it had been waiting for me to understand something it had not yet said aloud. In the dream, the rhythm resolved into a cadence that felt like a sentence, and, in the way that powerful dreams do, it did not speak words but spoke meaning. "We are here. We were here. Listen." When I woke, my palms were damp. The city outside my window had the same indifferent noise, but inside me something had shifted. The tapping had not been a demand for exorcism. It had been a summons to attention. It wanted, perhaps, the simplest human thing, to be acknowledged. There are moments when a person recognizes that the only reasonable response to a small, strange sorrow is to accept it and to return the kindness. I returned, then, in my own way. I sent copies of the letters I found to neighbors in the building. I left a small notebook in the chest in the basement with a new entry. My own account, a handful of names, dates, and odd little confessions. I wrote about the photograph and about the chair, about the way it would remember footsteps long after bodies have gone. I closed my note with a line I'd long since learned to live by. "If you hear the tapping, listen back kindly." Weeks later, I received an envelope with no return address. Inside was a photograph. The same outline in the window, only this one had been touched up with ink until the figure's edges were clearer. On the back, someone had written, Thank you for hearing us. That sentence was small and ordinary and devastating in its ordinariness. I kept that photograph by my bed for a time, as if proximity would preserve the exchange. I would like to end by telling you the tapping stopped altogether, that the apartment's small acoustics fell silent once the ledger names had been fed and the figurine placed on a shelf. That would be a neat and tidy final. The reality was more subtle. The tapping continued, but no longer with the urgency of a complaint. It had become a rhythm with a face I recognized. Patient, familiar, a metrical memory of all the small actions that compose a life. When it came now, it felt like a person reminding you of a shared joke. On my last night in the city, the one when the sky bloomed with a rare clarity and the air seemed to carry its own small hymns, I walked back to the building one final time. The courtyard smelled like laundry and the faint tang of incense. I climbed the stairs slowly, feeling that odd reluctance people get when they prepare to leave something unfinished. At the fourth-floor landing, the door to the apartment was open. A light spilled out, and the new tenant was there, holding the small ceramic woman in his palm, as if she were newly discovered. He saw me at the threshold and smiled, that wary, human smile you give people who share a secret. "We put your notes in the chest," he said, "and we left some bread on the sill for the cat. The tapping's been quieter." It seemed satisfied. He handed me the figurine, and for an instant I felt the full loop of stewardship. The thing was mine again, and yet no longer mine alone. We stood in the doorway, and, in that long suburban pause, I listened. The tapping came, gentle, a punctuation, and then it stopped as if the room had taken a breath. The silence that followed was not empty, but full of the things that happen when people remember each other, a soft warmth, the sense that a small community of ordinary acts had been acknowledged, and that acknowledgement had altered the atmosphere. I stepped outside finally and left. The city swallowed me with its usual noisiness, but I kept the figurine in my bag like a small talisman. In the months since, whenever I pass that part of town or think of the building, a memory of the tapping surfaces, a modest rhythm that asked only to be noted. It has practical lessons. Pay attention, keep archives, leave keys for unopened chests. It has larger ones, too. Humans make their own afterlives in places they live, and those afterlives sometimes demand only one modest courtesy, that someone will listen. If there is an ultimate closure to offer, it is this. The city keeps its histories whether you recognize them or not. The most potent thing you can do, sometimes, is the smallest. Sit down, listen, and respond kindly. The apartment's tapping remains an enigma in some narrow, literal sense. But it ceased for me to be uncanny and instead became a rhythm that taught me how to be attentive, how to become part of a small, human ledger. The last sound I remember from that fourth-floor room was not a knock or a scream, but a quiet succession of taps that resolved like a sentence. We were here. We are being heard. And the most surprising truth, the one that tightened my chest the first time I sensed it, is that listening, as banal as it sounds, can be the most urgent kind of action. It can change how noise registers inside a place. It can alter whether a house hoards loneliness or becomes a little archive of shared small mercies. The chair still sits in the photographs. The window still opens on windy nights. The tapping still comes occasionally, not as a summons to dread, but as a reminder that, for better or worse, we leave traces. If you ever find yourself in a room that seems to remember, sit properly, take notes, and listen. You may not solve everything, but you will be giving what small kindness you can attention. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe, share, and comment. Thanks for your attention.